Hello there, Mad Mike here, and welcome back to the channel. And today since it's kind of a slow news day, I wanted to just talk about a film series that I really, really enjoy, and I have ever since I was a kid, and that is the Godzilla films. It's one of those things that's kind of when you grow up with a lot of movies like that, especially a lot of kids from the 80s and 90s. We grew up with a lot of Godzilla movies, both coming out currently and ones that had been released previously. Um, and I wanted to go through a couple of my favorite entries. Now, I will say this: I'm kind of a I'm kind of a purist, and I should say purist, but I'm more partial to the Heisei era of Godzilla films as opposed to the original Toho films. Well, they're all Toho, but the first series of films that came out in connection with the original Godzilla. Even though I do still like those films, they're kind of like, they're a little they're hokey and goofy to be frank, but I do still enjoy them because it's Godzilla and because they are really funny in certain parts. But the Heisei era took things a bit more seriously. I liked the character model for Godzilla a bit more. It was a lot more menacing, even though Purity Sin now makes me always think of it as a fucking cat. Because he calls him Cat Godzilla, goddamn, because his face looks like a fucking cat. And if you actually freeze frame that and you actually stare at it long enough, you start to see it, which is why I hate the fact that now that's the thing. And I guess I've ruined a few other people's perspective on it too, if they've listened in this far. But I like the character design a little bit better. It's a bit more serious. It doesn't have those very wide eyes like the old one did. It's not as cartoony looking. It's a lot more detailed. And the other thing is the motions and stuff that it can do, even though, a lot of it was kind of, it was more advanced as a prop than the previous ones, which again might be the reason why I like it a bit more, because it makes it feel a bit more real. In addition to the fact that all the series along the way also had great special effects for the time. Anyway, all the miniatures and stuff that they have in those movies that get annihilated by the dudes in the costumes. I mean, that's got to be kind of disheartening for you if you're somebody that specifically is the miniature guy for the film, because a lot of sometimes they do blow up miniatures, but like in a Godzilla film they just decimate miniatures. Like there's nothing there. And it depends on, some of the stuff is more detailed than others. A lot of those buildings are probably balsa wood and cardboard for all I know. They break apart like it, and Godzilla walks through them. But the special effects in pretty much all of those films, other than maybe a couple of recent ones, are all really, really good, and especially for the time. And that's something that really attracted me to them when I was younger. Is like, oh, this looks really neat. There's not something that I can think of that I've seen that looks like this. And then you can kind of even date him all the way back, because, the original film came out in 1954, and that was actually one of the first films that I saw. I believe the first one I saw actually was Godzilla on Monster Island. I think that was the first Godzilla film I ever actually sat through when I was a kid. But the first Godzilla is up there with my favorites because it's a really good story. Now, I'm more familiar with the Americanized version, the one with Milton Berle, who's kind of put into various places in the film, rather than the traditional Japanese version. But I have seen both, and basically, it's kind of the only reason why Milton Berle's in the 54 one is just to kind of give Western audiences somebody to kind of latch onto in that. Even though I don't remember exactly if Milton Berle was a huge name at the time. I think that may have been before his Perry Mason days, or maybe midway through. So still, he was kind of the person that American audiences could latch onto, because that was really only in the American cut. The Japanese cut is all Japanese, and Milton Berle really he doesn't appear in that. In addition to that, the creature effects at the time again were fairly advanced. It was on par with what Hollywood was using at the time with some of their monster films that they were doing, because it was the 1950s, so they were doing a lot of very large monster films, stuff like Tarantula or Them or Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, stuff like that. So they were toying around a lot with that stuff, but the Japanese really they went with it, and they took it to a different level, because that's the other thing is when you look at Godzilla movies in terms of, like I said again, the special effects, and how. But at one point in time, the East and the West had very similar techniques when it came to making films, because Godzilla was very much like a lot of those 1950s films that I just talked about. but then you see it kind of diverge, where a lot of the Godzilla specifically almost kept with the miniatures. They kept with that kind of an aesthetic, whereas the American films, the 1950s monster films, just sort of died out. Every once in a while you'll see one of those type of films pop up, but after the 1950s, it was not a main staple for the American audience. However, Godzilla still sold very well over here despite that. So it was something really more with the aesthetic of the monster and how the world worked and how it was built. And I think that's why I really like the Heisei era of Godzilla films, which starts with Godzilla Returns in 1984, and I believe ends with Godzilla vs. Destroya, and I think that was 1993 or 1994, maybe. I could be wrong about that, but it was in the 90s. But that stretch of films, which encompasses 7 movies, because you have Godzilla Returns, Godzilla vs. Biollante, Godzilla vs. Mothra, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, Godzilla vs. Destroya, which I just mentioned, Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and also Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, which again, that was another one that was really fun. But like I said, all of those films are very good. Some of them are actually remakes of films that were done in the previous era of films. I can't remember the exact name of it. It begins with an S. But that was kind of those were kind of remakes of those movies. But again, they were updated. The aesthetics were changed. And again, I really do like a lot of those character models. The stuff with Mothra is basically identical. I can't remember if Anguirus is. I mean, he pops up, but his aesthetic is basically very similar as well. And then Godzilla, like I said, I like the changes with the more menacing looking aesthetic with the face and the body and everything, even though you kept the same basic shape and design. King Ghidorah is again very similar. Gigan is very similar. And then the other one that's kind of almost majorly changed is Mechagodzilla, which I actually really prefer the second Mechagodzilla over the first one. Again, kind of for aesthetic reasons, because the 80s one, I think Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 was in the 80s, but in the 80s one, well, in the second one, he's a lot more streamlined. There's not a lot of like technical stuff going on there. He's very sleek. He kind of looks like a new Ferrari. That's kind of what I equate him to almost. He's like looking at this big metal, like unpainted Ferrari almost. Like he's very sleek. Whereas the previous one is kind of like a very nice, like late 40s, early 50s, like Oldsmobile or Cadillac or something, like a really nice car, but it's very, very detailed. Whereas you look at the brand new Ferrari, like XL, whatever the fuck they have now, and it's sleek from beginning to end. You can barely even find the crack for the door. That's what I equate them to. Both still very nice aesthetically, but I do prefer the latter over the former, at least in terms of Godzilla. But like I said, I like that. They had all the villains return for the Heisei era. They added some new ones with like Space Godzilla and Biollante, which Biollante I think was probably the most original thing that they came up with at that point because of, the plant aspect and stuff like that. Godzilla didn't really have a villain like that before. So it was kind of interesting because mostly he just fought other monsters that originated on Earth and also various creatures that came out of space, which again is something Space Godzilla came from. And Space Godzilla, like I said, I like that design. And Destroya, too. Destroya was another one that was, I believe, an original character that they thought up during that era. And that movie, I think, is probably one of the best out of the bunch, period. I would probably put that at like maybe number 2 or 3 on my list after the first film. And the reason is because I love the aspect of burning Godzilla, like his form and the glowing aspect of the costume, and the change in the fire breath and stuff. Like you look at glowing Godzilla and you feel that he's more powerful than he normally would be. And then of course that movie has, the great twists and stuff at the end, and then they carry on the series and they go into like Godzilla 2000 and stuff like that, which I'm not really all that familiar with. I kind of leave it off at Destroya. And mostly I'm familiar with the first 2 eras basically, as opposed to the third era, and I think they might be onto a fourth now because they started one with Shin Godzilla, because I guess that takes place in its own universe because fuck continuity. But like I said, I like that aspect of it. I like the aspect of Destroya because Destroya looks very intimidating. it looks extremely intimidating. It has the massive, like, unicorn, like, samurai sword horn that's coming out of its head. His whole body just looks pointy. He's almost as intimidating as Gigan. Like, Gigan is an extremely intimidating looking monster. He has that, like, visor, and he's just, he has the two claws and stuff for hands and shit like that. He's very intimidating, and Destroyer reminded me a lot like that, and Destroyer felt like a very 80s villain. He looked like that could come out of like a rock video somewhere, and it would not be out of place. But that one's really good. Like I said, I love Godzilla vs. Biollante. There's a few other ones that are mixed in there as well, but those are just a couple that I wanted to highlight from my favorites list. But talking about the series as a whole, we talked about the reason why it's caught on for so long and the ideas behind that. But the other thing is that Godzilla kind of translates. Every time you have kind of a generation, almost Godzilla kind of reboots itself, or they start a new series. The original, I think it was called the Shota series or Shota or something. And the original series of films that originally came right after the original film, that whole bunch of movies was very much like I said, it was a little bit hokey, it was a little bit campy, but it was still fun, it was still entertaining, they're still good to watch. But then you had kind of that hardcore crowd after you got through that, where now you're into the 80s with the Heisei era, 80s and 90s, and now you see that it's more hard. It went like hardcore for the 80s. It went like, the dark and gritty tone. I know that was a big thing that got worn out a number of years ago, but back then everybody loved it. Mid 80s. 1984 was when Godzilla Returns comes out. Same year Terminator came out. Shit like that. So you got all this kind of dark science fiction-y stuff coming out, and then you have Godzilla who's rebooted in this kind of a bit more realistic and a bit more more down to earth, less silly kind of a universe. And I think it made the movies as films better, because I think that they had to increase the quality of the acting and the stories that revolved around those movies. And the other thing is the Heisei era also had all those movies connected. They were in one timeline. Now, if I remember correctly, the only other movie that was in that timeline was the original Godzilla film from 1954. But if I remember correctly, I don't know if even though all of the original films, the older films, were all technically, they went linearly, I don't believe they were ever, a lot of them didn't reference each other in terms of events that happened in those films, other than characters popping up here and there and stuff like that. Oh, hey, this is Godzilla versus this character, and now this character is in the universe, and this character pops up in the next movie. It's that kind of a thing where they just add monsters. It's not necessarily a thing where there's an actual progression. But when you look at the Heisei era, it actually does that. It actually progresses through, and elements of the other films come back in later movies, and they reintroduce themselves into other plot lines from other films. So watching all 7 of the films in order actually gives you a story. Again, that's something else that I kind of like about the Heisei era. But I think I've kind of covered everything I want to cover at this point. But I want to know what you think. What are you a fan of Godzilla? Do you like the series? Do you like any particular movies? List them below. Any other things? Favorite monsters, anything like that. What's your favorite era in Godzilla history? In terms of the films, put your thoughts in the comments below. As usual, I like to read them. Hit the bell for notifications, hit the like button, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?